Well, good morning. My name is Bob Parsley. I know that not all of you know me, but I'd like to tell you just a few things about myself before we get into Psalm 23. I preached my first sermon at age 14. I was called a preacher boy from that time on. And the Baptist tradition, I was licensed to preach at 17, went off to college, and then upon graduating college, my church ordained me to the gospel ministry at 22. I have preached well over 4,000 sermons, rarely ever repeated one. I never found one good enough to do twice. I served vocationally 7 churches over 44 years. Until 3 years ago this month, when I retired from a pastorate of a church in Maryland just outside of Washington, D.C. I have not preached before a congregation now in 3 years. So I've got a lot of catching up to do. Are you ready? Well, here goes. The Psalms were special to Jesus. I would dare say that he loved the Psalms. They were so special to him, if you think about it for a moment, in Matthew 27, verse 46, as he was dying on the cross, he exclaimed with some of his very last words, my God, why have you forsaken me?" That was directly quoting David's Psalm 22. That's how much he loved the Psalms. He said them as he was dying. But even more than that, he quoted them, sang them as he lived his whole life. He quoted from the Psalms repeatedly in his teaching ministry. The Psalms, I would tell you, gave him his identity, especially Psalm 23. Now, we have repeated it. The reason I didn't read Psalm 23 before I started was you already did about 12 times, So you've heard it. And now we can go back and look at it part by part and understand why it meant so much to Jesus. I would tell you that it was his favorite psalm, and here's why I suggest it was his favorite. Because in Psalm 23, he found out who he was early on. As a boy, he would have memorized this psalm. All Jewish children memorized the Psalms. Some of them could memorize all 150. That's how special they were. I think even as a boy, Jesus would have remembered and recited this psalm and realized that he would become the good shepherd. That everything that this Psalm 23 says about God and about us would say about him as God's son. So I suggest to you that Jesus had the great revelation of Psalm 23 as the magnifying glass where he could look at his own life and his purpose and his mission here, and he realized that he was to be our shepherd. And here's one reason I would suggest that. If you have your Bible, you can turn here in John chapter 10. In John chapter 10, about half the chapter is all about being a shepherd, and Jesus uses the local knowledge. Almost everyone there knew about sheep and shepherding because it was an agricultural place where he lived. Just a few verses, John chapter 10, beginning in verse 11, reading through verse 15. He says, "I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. The hired hand, who is not the shepherd and does not own the sheep, sees the wolf coming and leaves the sheep and runs away. And the wolf snatches them and scatters them. The hired hand runs away because a hired hand does not care for the sheep. I am the good shepherd. I know my own, and my own know me, just as the Father knows me, and I know the Father, and I lay down my life for the sheep." This is taught early in his ministry. He understands from the beginning that he's going to have to pay a dear price for us and for all who are part of his flock. For you see, a good shepherd would do everything to protect the sheep from the wolves and all those predators. I have to break it to you. Sad news. Sheep are some of the dumbest domesticated animals. There's a reason why we're compared to sheep. Because people do dumb things. Here's one of the dumbest things that sheep do. They see a clump of grass a little bit over there. I'm not used to one of these things. You have to forgive me. They see a clump of grass, And they say, ooh, that looks so green and so good, and they wander off. And they see another one, and they wander off. And before long, they're scattered, and they're so far away. A good shepherd uses his crook. He grabs that wanderer back, because it's only in the strength of the flock, with the protection of the shepherd, can they survive. Otherwise, they don't last long in the wilderness. Jesus is the shepherd of our souls. And that's how I tell you he thought of himself and his identity. Psalm 23 is filled with Hebrew phrases and imagery. It's beautiful. It's one of the things that I admire most. These are original sayings. Well, I grew up in a little sawmill town in the middle of Arkansas, in the home of my grandparents. They were born in 1890 and 1900. They were old when I was a kid, and they had old-time expressions. My grandmother had one, never used a profanity in her life, but whenever she was either shocked or astonished or wanted to really make a statement, she would say, "My stars and garters." Have you ever heard that one? Okay. That originated in the 1700s in England, and it is so weird. When I was a kid, I would go, what is she talking about? I didn't figure it out till I was probably, 20 years old. It was her idiom, her expression. Well, Hebrew has that sort of thing as well. And there are several things here in this passage which have that sort of thing to them. Another one my grandfather used to say in a heavy summer rain, he'd look out and he'd say, oh, this is a frog strangler. Again, what's a 10-year-old know about that? Well, David uses in Psalm 23 Hebrew imagery. I would tell you it was his experience as a shepherd boy which made this beautiful poem, this inspired piece of sacred writ, made it possible. For David's experience as a shepherd boy made personal the nature of God. Now you may say, well, Bob, you're getting all worked up over that. Well, I am, because let me tell you why. 3,000 years ago, almost all ancient people thought the gods, most people thought there were a lot of gods, were way up there. In fact, most people thought the gods were mean and that they would do things to them, zap them with lightning bolts, and that they were jealous of them and all this other. So most people thought of God removed and far away and distant. Even many of the Hebrew people thought of God as distant and far removed, but not David. For David, as he realized his relationship with God, he said something in this very first statement, which is mind-blowing at the time. The Lord is my shepherd. That's a divine revelation given to a young man for all time. Because, friends, because of what David wrote, because of what God the Father revealed to David, now we know that God is personal. He is my shepherd. He is my God. He is my friend. He is my protector. All the things that went along with being a shepherd, that's what God would do for me. So Jesus, when internalizing this and realizing this was his life mission, realized his primary task was to reveal the personal nature of God. And he did it so well. I've made many trips to Central America, and a number of times I made trips to serve the indigenous people of Guatemala. It took a long time to get back to where they were. Many of them did not even speak Spanish. They spoke Quiche and other Indian languages. But one of these little churches didn't have very much, gave me a tiny little banner, and it had the first verse of Psalm 23 on it. I still have it. It says, El Señor mi pastor, nada mi falta. And that meant, the Lord, my shepherd, nothing, nada, I lack. That meant so much to me, but what grabbed me was that word pastor. Pastor, shepherd, same thing in Spanish. It's translated that way for them. And I realized that Jesus is my pastor. Now, I've had a lot of pastors I've loved and some not so much. I've been a pastor. I'm sure there are people who love me and some not so much. But there is a pastor who will never let you down. Maybe you have a story of a bum pastor who ran away and did something stupid. Well, Jesus is our pastor, a pastor who will always guard our souls, for he is the shepherd of our souls. He is the one who protects us and loves us and will always do so. He said he would never leave us or forsake us. He won't be like that hired hand I read to you in Psalm 10. He will never run away. Now we may run, but he will not. For that is his nature, to be steadfast and true. The other thing that's so beautiful about this idea of the personal nature of God, you may have heard this, you may not have. The Jewish people revered the personal name of God, which was revealed to Moses, the burning bush. It's translated from the Old King James as Jehovah. I know you've heard that before. When it's in the Hebrew Bible, translated into English, Jehovah. Here's the thing. Jewish people never say the personal name of God, even to this day. They didn't in David's time. Instead, whenever the personal name of God appeared, they use another word besides his personal name. They would say Adonai, which meant Lord. It was a substitution word. Again, you may or may not have heard that. This is what reverence they had for God. But think about this for a moment, what David did. David, probably still a young man writing this, said, "The Lord is my shepherd." This one who is above all, the Creator, the great loving God, loves me. Well, we could say a lot more, but we move on. So we see then that God the Father demonstrates his love for us. He is personal. And then we learn not to focus on our wants. I shall not want. Or, in the Spanish, nada me falta. Nothing I lack, literally in Spanish. That's what that was. I'd like to read to you a passage from Philippians. I preached from this book the last 6 months of my last church in Maryland. I literally went verse by verse for 6 months. This book means so much to me. It's Paul's love letter to the church of Philippi, and I presented it as such to that last congregation I served. And these words in Philippians mean so much to me, for they directly relate to what David says in this little phrase, I shall not want. I'll read it now. Philippians 4, verse 11, if you want to read it along. Not that I am referring to being in need, for I have learned to be content with whatever I have. I know what it is to have little, and I know what it is to have plenty. In any and all circumstances, I have learned the secret of being well fed and of going hungry, of having plenty, and of being in need. I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. One of the greatest verses in the whole New Testament. And I would tell you, directly relates to what David said in this second phrase. I shall not want. I shall not want because I have Christ who strengthens me. Now you think about where you are now in your life. If you're like me, you have things going on with your body. Right now I have plantar fasciitis in both feet. I try not to show it. When I go out the golf course, I limp around. Everybody thinks I'm some spaz weirdo, because I'm trying to walk and play golf. And why do you even do that when your feet are hurting? I guess that's what crazy golfers do, like play in the rain and other stuff. All of us have something wrong with us or with our lives. And yet this is what we say. With Christ, I have all I need. Whatever my ailments, whatever life's problems I face. So nothing I lack. Nada I lack. So we plow forward. Jesus as my shepherd then helps me restore my soul. I'm going to talk a bit more about that word soul in a minute. He gives us our purpose. He restores us. He brings us back to where we should be. And how exactly does he do that? Well, first, he helps us find green pasture. That's a good, what we need to eat. It's a good place to lay down. It's comfortable. And then he finds still waters. Now that is a really interesting phrase in Hebrew. For what that says in Hebrew is this. Beside still waters, literally, is the phrase by waters of rest. I don't know if you've ever heard that before, but that's literally what it means. And here's what a shepherd had to do. Sheep would not drink from a fast-running stream. They're skittish, again, not very smart. So a shepherd would get large stones and form kind of a partial break, a water break. So there'd be some still water, and a pool it up, and then the sheep would drink from it. They'd be glad to drink from that. That's the kind of trouble that a real shepherd would go to. Not a hired hand. A hired hand wouldn't care. He'd just say, those dumb sheep. But a loving shepherd would provide for his sheep, provide good pasture land, provide for this waters of rest. For you see, the good spots aren't always easy to find. A good shepherd would think ahead and say, I think over that next hill there might be a good spot. And he will go out of his way to find that for his flock. This is what Jesus has done for us. Because again, he internalized this role as good shepherd. And you may say, I don't understand God's plan. I don't know what he's doing with me. I don't know what Jesus has in store for me. Let me assure you, he has for you green pastures ahead. He has for you still waters. That is his goal, his promise, and he will do it. Not just because I said so, but because David 3,000 years ago, and I would tell you almost as a kind of prophecy, said this is what the good shepherd will do and is doing. I just have to make one aside about David. He did a lot of terrible things in his life. He was guilty of murder. He was a man of war. He was guilty of other sins. And yet God loved him. Why did God love him? Because David made himself sensitive to God, open to this kind of revelation. He was able, through his experience as a shepherd, to write something like this under the influence of the Holy Spirit. How wonderful for David to leave us this. And you may say to yourself, well, how can God use me? I've done a lot of things. Have you killed anybody? Have you committed adultery? Have you done the things that David did? I don't think so. And yet God loved him and used him. God will use you if you'll just let him. If you'll be open to the revelation that he will pour out through you. There's an old hymn, you might have heard it, about being a channel of blessing. Make me a channel of blessings, the chorus. Will you allow yourself as a Christian to be a channel of blessing? Because usually we're the ones who stop up the stream. Because we do not acknowledge the fact, maybe we say we're not good enough or we're not worthy, or that's hogwash. Because if David can be given this kind of wonderful revelation, you can be too. God can use you. Never discount the kind of people God uses. So there's another question I have to ask. It's one that Jesus asked in Luke chapter 9, 25. He says this, what does it profit a man if he gains the whole world and loses or forfeits himself? It's a question everyone has to ask. What does it profit us to gain the whole world? And literally, it gains us nothing. So I'd like to go on now to verse 3 and talk to you about this special word, soul. It's unique, it's special, and I want to teach you how to say it. It's different because of its many meanings. The word is nephesh, and it's spelled N-E-P-H-E-S-H. And I want you to say it with me. Nephesh, nephesh, nephesh. Now, you can speak Hebrew. That word means soul, but it just as likely can be translated as life or spirit. It's used many times in the Old Testament, and it often appears as any of those three. In the Hebrew mind, nephesh meant hub, the center, the life energy. And here's a point I really want to stress to you. What Jesus does for you and me in restoring our soul is he switches the polarity of our lives. We switch from being a negative person, a selfish person, a sinner, if you want to use that word, and he makes us a positive person, switches it all around. He makes us a person who's Christ-like, Christ-centered, mindful of others, thinking of God. This is what he does in restoring our soul, switching polarity. That is such a powerful image for me. This is what he does and will do and will continue to do. Plowing ahead, we're told that he will lead us in paths of righteousness for his name's sake. He does it because he wants to. He does it because we need it. There's so much more I can say, but the word righteous is really special. Only God is really righteous. We know this because the prophet Isaiah in Isaiah 64:6 says, all of our ways are as filthy rags, all of our righteousness. Human righteousness is paltry and puny and, frankly, nothing to brag about. And yet so many people do. In my many years of ministry, I've had so many people tell me, well, I'm not so bad. I'm not such a bad person. I haven't done nearly as many bad things as she has. Or you should know my ex-wife. Or my father-in-law, he's the worst person ever lived. And they'll tell you some horrible thing about him. That won't cut it. It's not good enough. You can't compare yourself to others' righteousness because there's always someone who's better than you. But guess what? To quote a little 5-year-old boy, the bestest one was Jesus. You had to quote yourself to him or compare yourself to him. Are you perfect? No. Am I? No. So your righteousness and mine is as filthy rags. Continuing on, we're told that Jesus walks with us in life through the valley of the shadow of death. What a powerful, powerful thing. Through our darkest valleys. It is his presence which makes it possible for us to survive the worst. I had a friend named Sam who was in the chaplaincy program, the same one I was in. He went through it at a different time. But Sam was super shy, didn't like to talk much. And he was called into a family mourning. They were crying. Their mother had just died. He walked in the room. They were sobbing. He didn't know what to say. He didn't say anything. He sat down there and cried with them. He went back to our boss and he said, Ed, I really messed up. I didn't say a word. I just went in there and sat and cried, and I just got up and left. Ed said, well, that's all right. Maybe next time you'll get it right, Sam. Those people wrote a letter to our boss and said, this chaplain, Sam, was the best chaplain we ever saw, best one we ever had. He came in, he cried with us when our mother died. We think so much of him. What he thought was a mistake was a great blessing. So you think about this for a moment. Whatever trauma you've had, a near-death experience, something terrible, Jesus' presence is there. He's there in our darkest times. Literally in Hebrew, that phrase is darkest valley. So when we say the valley of the shadow of death, it does remind the fact that death causes fear in everyone. It's the great bugaboo. People are so afraid to die. I know so many people scared of death. And yet the presence of the shepherd, Jesus, will provide comfort because he has the tools of protection, his rod and his staff. His staff has the crook on it, pulls us back in. His rod is actually a tool that he can beat back predators. He can do so much for us if we'll only let him. Well, there's much more I could do with this, but I want to go on to the second half because there's a real break here. The first 4 verses are all about the shepherd boy, David, and Jesus as the good shepherd. But then the imagery takes a big switch. We go from the pasture to the palace. Because here we are talking about grander and beautiful things. When David became a young man, he went into the palace of Saul, if you'll remember that. He sang for Saul. Who knows, he may have even sang Psalm 23 to Saul, the king, before him. In this sudden shift, we see images in 4 parts that are very powerful. This is in verses 5 and 6. First of all, we hear that there's a lavish banquet which is made for us in the presence of our enemies or before our enemies. This again shows Jesus' provision and his approval of us. Now think about this for a moment. In Bible times, most people had never seen such a thing. They were what we call subsistence living. They just barely had enough to eat. They never saw a banquet like this. But what David says to us, what Jesus will provide for us, is a banquet in that he will provide for everything. This would have dazzled people in David's time, even in Jesus' time. The fact that there would be so much, it would be spread out more than anyone could possibly eat. Jesus blesses us in ways we cannot even number or imagine. So it is. This is his way. We're told also that our heads would be anointed with oil. That in ancient times showed hospitality. You pour oil on someone's head. It was kind of used sometimes as a medicine. It was a dry climate used to make people feel better. It was a sign of blessing. And of course, it also showed that someone was very special. They're anointed. Someone's made a prophet or a royalty person was anointed. The specialness is on display in the presence of our enemies. And even more than that, our cup overflows, meaning that it's so much it just spills out. This is the immeasurable blessing of Jesus for us. And David saw it in Psalm 23, 1,000 years before Jesus lived. Then we're told that goodness and mercy will follow us all the days of our life. Why is that? I would suggest to you, as Christians, goodness, which also could be translated as usefulness, and mercy, which could be translated as kindness just as easily from Hebrew. Goodness and mercy, usefulness and kindness will be our reputation. Why? Because he gives us the gifts to be good and merciful. It's not in us. It's not inherent in us. But he makes us so that we have that reputation. Have you ever been, I won't make you raise your hands, but I've been on the subway in New York many times. And there's some of the smelliest people I've ever seen. Boy, there's some real stinkers on that thing. A lot of them are homeless. I'll put it like this, they don't wear Depends, okay? That's enough, okay? And I feel sorry for them. And wherever they go, they leave this bad smell. You can literally see people make this face as they walk through the car. I've seen this multiple times. The exact opposite is for us. We're to leave a trail, a fragrant trail of goodness and kindness. That's what follows us. Instead of being turned off, people should see the blessings of Christ in the way we live, and he will provide that. He'll let us have that kind of reputation. The last part of the psalm is so powerful, for it says that we will dwell in the house of the Lord forever, or we will live in his palace. In Hebrew, literally, for the length of all days. It's the big house. That's where we'll be with him. Again, most people in Bible days couldn't even imagine being in something like this. But this is what Jesus says. I've gone to prepare a place for you, and where I go, there you may be also. I would like to close by telling you a little closing story. My grandmother's baby sister was a singer, but not maybe a kind you would know. She was an expert in shape note music. You've probably never heard of it. It's in the South. And she used to go to what they called singing conventions, where they would use shape note hymnals. And the songs were, a lot of them I never heard before or since. But there was one that they sang at almost every one of the conventions I went to with Aunt Clem. I guess I sang it at the first time when I was 12. I haven't forgotten it. I won't sing it, but I'm going to say it to you because it makes me think of the last part of verse 6 of Psalm 23. I've got a mansion on top of a hilltop in that bright land where we never grow old. And someday yonder, I'll never more wander and walk those streets of fairest gold. Now that's country, right? That's sort of how I grew up. I want you to know that it's a great honor for me to get to stand before you as a member of the church. I guess you could officially call me a layman now. That's what I've wanted to be. I wanted to help out any way I could. I've taught children's Sunday school class. I've done security stuff. And, you know, even if they ask me to take out the trash, I'm glad to do that too. But I'm very pleased that Craig asked me to do this today. And it also makes me happy to know that most of the elders aren't here. They did that on purpose. They said, you know, who can we get to do this today? Oh, yeah, Bob. Thank you for listening so attentively. I do appreciate it a great deal. And we're going to finish up with some songs. So come right on up. And have any of you ever twisted your ankle like that? Yeah, it takes a while to heal. Anyway, thank you very much, band, and thank you, congregation.